and put you on. Yeah.
We're here today as a guest of John Davis, one of the charter members of the California Association of Criminalists, and we're going to talk to him today a little bit about the early days of the CAC and his involvement with the establishment of the Code of Ethics. Before we get into that, John, perhaps it'd be of interest to the viewers if you could tell us a little bit of background information, starting, for instance, how you initially became interested in criminalistics.
Well, I was in high school when I first became interested in the subject. We had a family friend who happened to be a police officer who was interested in criminalistics and who actually got me interested in it. Gave me a correspondence course in crime detection techniques that he had taken, and encouraged me to go on to school to study the subject. I was interested in it, and I did go to Cal and entered the School of Criminology at that time.
Was that one of the few places you could take a course of this type in those days?
So far as I know, it was the only one. There was another course at Northwestern in Chicago area, but my understanding is they had either closed down or just were ready to close down and discontinue operations of that school, so that Cal was the only option open to me.
How long had the program been active at the University of Berkeley?
That I really don't know, but I think it was a matter of a relatively few years, like maybe 3 to 5 if I had to guess.
I see. And who was principally involved with presenting the courses in the field at that time?
Well, Dr. Paul Kirk was the head of the program there, and he had, actually he was a professor of biochemistry, as I recall, but he had become interested in crime detection through contacts with local police departments and had actually worked on a number of cases for them, became sufficiently interested that he set up the program in technical criminology, as it was then known, under the department in the life science building, and that's where he had his office and where we took the major courses that gave us our eventual expertise in crime detection techniques.
Who were some of your fellow students at that time that later went on in the field of criminalistics?
Well, there are about, in the one class that was given by Dr. Kirk in crime detection principles, or the scientific examination of physical evidence, there were about 8 students. They included Jack Cadman, who eventually went on to Orange County to set up a laboratory in the Sheriff's Department. There's Pat Fuller, who worked with me in the Oakland Police Department for some years. Dave Bird, who was in the CII, a laboratory in Sacramento. Ruth Johnson, a girl, but I don't know what became of her. I don't think she ever worked in the field. Roy Lauer, who eventually became an attorney, I believe. Bill Prawn, I don't know what became of him. A fellow by the name of Ehrlich, and I think there were 8 of us all together. Then in the same classroom, Lowell Bradford was taking his work in biochemistry. He was working in the same laboratory, but in a different section. And I think he did not measure or did not major in criminalistics, so far as I know. But he was there at the same time, and he eventually became head of the Santa Clara County laboratory.
When we look at a modern day criminalistics laboratory, we see a proliferation of various types of so-called sophisticated instrumentation. Maybe you could recount to us what sophisticated instrumentation you had available to you at the university at that time.
Well, I think the most sophisticated item we had was probably an antique microscope. There was very little in the way of instrumentation available to us. And it's true that the microscope was probably the most sophisticated item that we had. We did some toxicological work, a lot of chemical microscopy, and that's of course the area that utilized the microscope the most. We studied a number of different types of items which might be physical evidence, types of materials which would be involved in crimes, but they did not involve any scientific instruments of the type that we have today.
When did you leave the university, graduate from the university, and work?
I graduated in December of 1941, and after graduation I went to Missouri State Highway Patrol in Jefferson City. I worked there in the laboratory for about 2 years doing a variety of case examinations, examining blood stains, seminal stains, some toxicology even, and tool marks, some firearms work, very few fingerprint types of examinations, just general crime scene evidence cases.
While you were back in Missouri, you started a journal called The Technician at that time.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
What prompted you to do that? Why did you feel it was necessary?
I wasn't self-prompted in that situation. There was a fellow visiting the laboratory from the fire underwriter's laboratory. His name was Steinmetz. I remember the name, but I don't remember exactly who he was. But he was talking to my superior and brought up the subject that we needed an organization or a journal to distribute information in the field of criminalistics, and that there was none at that time. He thought perhaps we could think about it and maybe do something about it. And my boss was interested and I was interested, so we decided to start the little journal, which we called the Police Laboratory Technician. And in that we wrote a number of articles attempting to promote the idea of a crime laboratory organization and the like. We had a number of different people submit articles to that magazine, and a great deal of correspondence, and there was a lot of interest in the idea of the magazine or the journal and in the idea of an organization, but times were not quite right, I think, for the development of one at that time.
This would have been right during the Second World War.
Yes, the tail end of the war, or the middle of the war, and it was not, there just were not enough people in position to do anything about it.
How long were you there?
2 years. I left in 1944.
And then you came out to Oakland, California.
Right. Came back to Berkeley and eventually applied to and got a job with the Oakland Police Department. And, they did not have a police laboratory at all, but they had a couple of pieces of equipment, a comparison microscope and stereo microscope, and they were willing to give me a try and put me on as an emergency patrolman in 1944, in July.
And where were you located, your laboratory at that time?
I was on the, what was called the mezzanine floor of the City Hall in Oakland. And I had a small room about 16 by 18 feet in size. It had been a storeroom, and in fact was a storeroom when I took over. And I gradually was able to move things out of it and into it, and eventually set up a small laboratory.
What, your first case work there, what types of cases did you primarily deal with?
Well, I handled a lot of crime scene examinations for fingerprint work because I had had experience in that area, and took photographs at crime scenes, gathered such evidence as I could find, and worked on primarily things that didn't require advanced chemistry because I didn't have chemical facilities. But I had a microscope, a stereo microscope, comparison microscope, and photographic equipment so that I could make examinations of tool marks, bullets, and fingerprints, and small evidence items of that type.
While you were in Oakland, and along with all of the casework you did, you were involved in quite a bit of research there in a number of different areas, weren't you?
Over the years I was, yes. I think I had a characteristic of, when I worked on a case, seeing problems that needed to be solved in connection with certain type of evidence, and as time permitted, I would attempt to solve some of those problems.
One of the famous items of your research was the striograph, as I recall.
Right.
In fact, it became a partial subject of a book you authored.
That's true, yes.
Later years. How did you get the idea for the striograph in the first place?
Well, I got the idea from a magazine that I read on, it was called Machinery. And it was some sort of a magazine that treated of industrial machinery and analytical tools. And there was an ad in there from the Timken Roller Bearing Company, which showed how smooth their bearings were, and the smoothness was illustrated by means of a graph that they had traced on an instrument they called a profilograph. So I wrote them and eventually got them to send me information on the instrument and to actually make a run on the tool mark that I prepared for them. I was impressed with its possibilities, and thereafter I modified the method that they used in the instrument and came up with the striograph for examining the contour of tool marks and bullets.
And the striograph was a mechanical instrument that also employed photography and optics, wasn't that correct?
Right. Yes, it involved a tracing needle which traced over the contour of the object in question, and a lever, one end of which was placed in front of a microscope lens, which projected an image of that moving lever out to a prism and back to a recording instrument where it was photographed and further developed to give me a chart of the contour.
Let's take a break now. John, in addition to your research with the striograph, you also did quite a bit of research in a number of other areas. One, I assume, goes back to the early interest in chemical microscopy you had during your time at Cal, and you did quite a bit on confirmatory tests for drugs. How did you happen to embark on that rather extensive survey?
Well, I don't know. I was always intrigued by chemical microscopy, and I really enjoyed it. As you recall, in the course that we had at Cal, most of the work we did with chemical microscopy, a la Chameau and Mason, was on inorganic compounds, but there were many organic compounds for which chemical microscopy tests were available, and I became quite interested in them, and later did develop a sort of identification procedure for the barbiturates, which I think was published in the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology some years later. That work I did when I was in the Oakland Police Department. When I was in Missouri, I did work with chemical microscopy also, and attempted to improve on a few tests or develop tests for certain materials, but I can't recall anything in the way of a schematic process that resulted from those. In the little publication that we had there, which was called The Technician, we mentioned that a few minutes ago, I would publish little, what I called technical notes. And if I observed a good chemical reaction or a crystal reaction with some material when I was working in the lab, I would write that up as a technical note and put it in that little journal for other people to consider in case they were interested. At that time, I was receiving mail from different people who received The Technician, and I would sometimes get ideas and tips from them, and those would be utilized. I discovered that a number of people were interested in chemical microscopy around the country, but most of them had not had any training or experience in it. And I always considered that that was one of the most valuable types of training that we got in the course under Dr. Kirk. It was very useful for the types of materials that we had to examine in the police laboratory.
At that time, there wasn't an awful lot published. I mean, you didn't go into a store and buy a shelf full of textbooks on criminalistics.
No, there were very few books in criminalistics or criminology at that time. There were a few special books for example, Hatcher's book on firearms, There was the old Soderman and O'Connell book on titled Modern Criminal Investigation. There were certain books on specific subjects like, say, bombs and explosives, some books on bloodstains, but there were no general criminalistics books that I can think of. And the library that would actually constitute a criminalistics library would be very small in those days. And there were only one or two journals published. The technical journals were the old Police Science Journal, which eventually was incorporated into the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology. That was about the only journal that was available to us outside of the IAI fingerprint publication.
Nowadays, if one goes to a CAC meeting, you'll note that a large portion of the papers deal with a vast array of techniques for examining bloodstains and other physiological fluids. Can you relate to our listeners what was available, say, in the late 40s and early 50s in that area for the criminalist to use?
Well, there was very little in the way of published information, and about the only test that we could run on bloodstains was a test to show that it was or was not a human, or could run the precipitin test for various other animals. And if we could do the major blood grouping test, that is the ABO group, on a dry blood stain, we could say that we were doing quite well. And there were a lot of criminals that couldn't even do that. So that the number of factors that are determined now in a blood stain or any physiological fluid is so great compared to what we were doing then, it's rather astonishing, really.
You mentioned your early days in Oakland, that you actually did fingerprint processing at crime scenes.
Yes.
Is that why you became interested in developing a better fingerprint brush and came out with your glass fiber brush?
No, I had much experience at crime scene in developing latent fingerprints, as you say, I pointed out earlier. In fact, for about 5 or 6 years, I went out to crime scenes daily. But I wasn't all that happy with the fingerprint brushes that were available at that time, but I never really set out to develop a better fingerprint brush. The fingerprint brush that you're referring to is one that I've been making and selling since about the 1957 or 58 period of time. But I actually made the first brush for use with sulfuric acid on the so-called diphenylamine test for powder residues on the paraffin caps. I didn't like that test. I never believed in it, but there were times when I had to run it to make somebody happy. And I thought rather than spraying or dipping this sulfuric acid reagent, I could make a fiberglass brush, and the acid wouldn't eat up the fibers as it would a hairbrush. So I made a fiberglass brush. Well, it did not work for the sulfuric acid because of a certain resinous components on the fibers, which I was not aware were present at that time, and it interfered with the test. But the softness of the brush impressed me so much that I decided to try it on some fingerprints, and I couldn't believe the results that I got. They were so superior to what I had gotten with the old camel's hair brush. So, long story short, I developed it further and eventually put it on the market.
That's sold throughout the United States now.
It is, and
used by quite a number of people.
Yes, and it's sold overseas. There's a couple of agencies that sell them in Europe, England, South America, Africa. So it's been quite successful. Contrary to the development of my striograph, which cost me a couple $1,000 for a patent, and I never made a dime on it, nor the book that resulted. I never made a dime on the book. But the fingerprint brush, which sells for a few dollars, has done me rather well.
Shortly after you arrived in Oakland, there were other criminalists at that time in the Northern California area. I assume that maybe you had some contact with. What other laboratories were open, say in Oh, the late 40s.
Well, when I came to Oakland in 1944 and first set up the laboratory, the only other laboratory in this area was San Francisco. Frank LaTulip was the criminalist in the San Francisco Police Lab, and Dave Bird was up in Sacramento in the CII lab, which would now be the DOJ lab. Roger Green was the actual head of that laboratory and their chief criminalist, but he at that time was in the service, and Dave Bird had gone to work in Sacramento about the same time that I went to Missouri. And I had kept in touch with Dave Bird, and we wrote letters back and forth, and he sent me pictures of his laboratory, and I sent him pictures of mine in Missouri. And so we kept in touch. But aside from those two persons, there were no other laboratories in the area. I don't recall what year it was, but it wasn't too long before Hillard Reeves was employed by the Richmond Police Department to set up a laboratory there, and we were rather close and in close contact and frequently exchanged information and analytical techniques. Later, I believe it was later, could have been earlier, Lowell Bradford set up the one in Santa Clara County, and I think that was about the only 3 or 4 laboratories in Northern California at that time.
Eventually, those of you who were in the field in California did sort of come together, and which eventually resulted in the formation of the CAC. What was the manner in which you first happened to gather together?
Well, I think that Lowell Bradford, as I understand it, Lowell Bradford had been in touch with Ray Pinker and probably with Roger Green, and they had talked about the idea of forming an organization for exchanging information, and it's my understanding that they were the beginning spark plug for the whole organization. Now, just who had the idea or how it came about, I don't know. You would have to talk to Lowell on that. But eventually, in Oakland, we received letters, or a letter from Lowell, I believe it was, telling us that there was going to be a meeting of criminalists at Santa Clara in the early 1950s. And he was hoping to get criminalists from the various laboratories there so that we could get together and see if there was a need for an organization. And so far as I recall, that was the original basis for the CAC.
Was there a technical program at that first meeting?
I think there was. I can't remember any of the papers that were presented, except that I know that Lowell had asked me to bring some of the pictures that I had taken with my stride graph, some of the charts that I had taken, and to discuss the instrument. And I'm almost certain that was the very first meeting. If I'm wrong, it was at some other meeting, but it was very early. And so that obviously the only impressive paper was the one on the stride graph.
It's the only one you remember.
It's the only one I remember. But seriously, there were discussions by other people present. I just don't happen to remember who discussed what papers, and I can't even remember all of the people who were present at that meeting. It was just sort of a get-together and just enough technical information to give us the idea of what might develop.
Was the decision made at that meeting to form an organization?
I'm sure that there was a decision at that time to continue the process. In other words, to have another meeting to see how it would go. And sooner or later, an organization did, in fact, come out of it.
Shortly after the formation, then, of the California Association of Criminalists, a decision was made to establish a code of ethics.
Yes.
Now, that decision was no doubt based upon some perceived need at that time, and you became very involved in the drafting of that code.
I did, yeah.
Could you give us a little background on why there was felt the need for this code, and how you went about writing a code of ethics?
I cannot actually remember the details of how it developed, that we felt that we needed one, except that in considering the fact that we wanted, and I think had decided, in fact, to form an organization, as with any organization, one starts to think, well, now what do we have to do? We have to write a constitution, we have to write this, we have to make a list of the type of members that we're going to have, and so on. And I'm sure that in that process, the Code of Ethics was one of the items that we felt we should have as an organization, as would the attorneys or the doctors, any variety of professional people. And I think that's how the subject came up. There had been cases over the years, both in California and elsewhere, which indicated that there were some ethical problems, conduct of different people working in this field, both here and outside of California, which suggested that something in the way of a code of ethics would be a good idea, and I think that's how it came about.
As I recall, the Code of Ethics, you just didn't sit down and write one and everybody accepted it, because when I attended my first meeting in 1957, you were still rewriting drafts, as I recall.
That could be. I know that they published a note in one of the recent CAC newsletters indicating the date on which the code had been finally accepted. And I think it was around 1958 or thereabouts, later than I would have thought, because we had begun writing it earlier than that by 3 or 4 years. But then, of course, with meetings only twice a year, it takes a while to get everybody together to evaluate it.
What were some of the problems you encountered in writing a Code of Ethics? Did you have a guide you followed, some other association, or just what?
Well, I don't recall at which meeting it was decided that there would be a Code of Ethics written and that there would be a committee to write it. And I was appointed chairman of the committee, and I think there were 3 people altogether on it. I know that Dave Bird was one. The other member, aside from myself and Dave Bird, was I believe, either Don Harding or Willard Reeves. I think it was Don Harding, but you would have to check with him on that. And the basic process involved was that I sort of took the bull by the horn, sat down at my typewriter one day and started writing this thing. And I wrote up essentially what I thought would be a good code of ethics, and incorporated into it some of the ideas that I had received from people who had written to me, even in Missouri when I was writing for the technician. Incorporated other ideas which I had received from the people who had been present at the first 2 or 3 meetings of the CAC. They had suggested that there was a problem here or a problem there, and I would incorporate that idea into the CAC. And there were others which were based on my own personal experience or problems with some of the situations which I had seen or faced in my own work. So that the CAC Code of Ethics finally was, or as it came out in its original draft, was a compilation of all of these sources of information and ideas. Now I did, before I wrote it, or before I started writing it, I looked at the codes of ethics of medical society, the legal organizations, and a couple of others, and I didn't feel that the approach they used was satisfactory for our needs. So I sort of used my own ideas in organizing it. When I got through with it, I sent copies of it to Dave Bird and to the other member, which may have been Don Harding, and got ideas back from them, changed the code to meet their objections, and eventually it was submitted to the membership of the beginning group of the CAC for their review. And there were hassles and discussions and some changes, some deletions and some additions to the code. They were appropriately recorded, and eventually the finished product resulted.
It served a purpose not only to guide an individual who was in the organization, but to give some mutual support to people. You mentioned your fingerprint brush and what it was, the test it was designed to be used on before it was a fingerprint brush.
Yeah, that's right. The diphenylamine test for gunpowder residues. I think it's also known as the Castellanos test.
Right.
The Cuban who developed it as a means of detecting nitrates in gunpowder, which might be on somebody's hands. Yes.
That became a sort of an ethical issue within the CAC, didn't it?
I think it did. In fact, it was perhaps not so much an ethical problem as a technical problem, that there were a number of people who would not accept that as being a reliable indication of the presence of gunpowder residue, because it would give positive reactions with nitrates or nitrites from other sources. There were other people who felt that they could, by looking at the blue coloration which resulted from the reaction, really could identify gunpowder particles. And there were the two sides, the people who thought it was good, those who thought it was not. And the ethical problem would arise, of course, when perhaps testimony might be given by someone who thought the test was a valid and reliable indication, and that testimony might be opposed by somebody who thought it wasn't that reliable. Then there came the question, was it ethical to present a positive conclusion as evidence of something when there was some doubt in the minds of reasonable people, reasonable experts, as to its validity. So that type of thing was helped, I think, by the CAC in the regulations or the rules that were put in the Code of Ethics to govern this type of situation.
As I recall, there was some reluctance once it was decided by members of the CAC that the test wasn't a positive indication of a discharge of a weapon. The police still wanted the test run. Wasn't that a problem?
Yes, the investigators frequently wanted to have the test run either for psychological purposes when they talked to the suspect or the defendant if they got a positive reaction, and some of them wanted it because they believed in it, whether the criminals believed in it or not. And there were those situations in which a department head might demand that the criminals run the test whether he thought it was valid or not. And I think we had occasions in which we actually had to make such a determination ourselves. We did not interpret the test, but we had to tell them what our results were, and they took it from there. This was not, of course, a type of situation which I liked. I felt that the criminalist should be the one who made a decision as to whether he would consider a test worthy of being utilized in any respect.
As you came together as a sort of a mutual support group as well as a technical exchange group, just who were involved in what laboratories are we talking about at that time?
The California laboratories that were in existence at the time that the CAC was originally formed and that the Code of Ethics was being developed or had been just developed included laboratories such as Ray Pinker, of course the forensic chemist for the Los Angeles laboratory. I think there was a representative from the Los Angeles Sheriff's Office, not immediately perhaps, but George Lacey was eventually a member of the CAC, and one of the early members. San Bernardino laboratory had not yet been created. Orange County, Jack Cadman, had already established the laboratory down there. And then further north was the Santa Clara County Laboratory, where Lowell Bradford was in charge. Dave Bird and Roger Green from Sacramento, that is the state laboratory. Hillard Reeves from Richmond, and Latula from San Francisco did not participate in the CAC, but he did have a laboratory and was functioning. And Oakland. There was no laboratory in any other part of Northern California that I'm aware of.
And you did have one private examiner.
Dr. Kirk was a private consultant in criminalistics at the University of California.
And also was there another one in Southern California.
That's right. Bill Harper who worked in Pasadena. In fact, Bill Harper was a member of, and one of the early members of the CAC. I think he may have come to the very first meeting. He was a friend of Ray Pinker, and I'm almost certain that he was at the first meeting. He eventually decided to drop out of the organization for personal reasons, but I think those were the only two private consultants in the state, as far as I'm aware of.
I would imagine that the initial exchange of information was beneficial to everybody that participated. Did just the organization of these individuals from the various labs have any other beneficial effects on the field at that time?
Well, I think probably the greatest benefit was as you point out, the eventual exchange of information that comes about when a group of technical people get together and can exchange tips of the trade, so to speak, and the papers that were presented at the meetings became more and more sophisticated. Those were major benefits which cannot be overlooked. I think another major benefit, which was not quite so obvious perhaps, simply the greater friendliness between the various members of the different laboratories, which prior to the formation of the CAC had in fact been rather isolated and frequently at odds with each other over technical procedures or case examinations.
Certainly from the time you first entered the field, first left, participated in the program at Berkeley, and today there have been vast changes in the field of criminalistics, not only in California but throughout the world.
Yeah.
What are some of the more surprising changes that you've seen occur that you never would have anticipated perhaps ever occurring when, let's say, when the CAC was first formed?
Well, it's hard to really put my finger on all those things, but I think that there are a number of important things which have happened. One is the almost an explosion in terms of literature that is being published and the organizations which exist. I'm very impressed, for example, with the publication of the Firearms and Tool Marks Examiners, which I think have put out a tremendous amount of valuable material in that specialty, which prior to their existence was almost without any literature at all, except for a few books. The publications of the Forensic Science Society and other criminalistics type organizations have been very helpful. The rapid growth and sophistication of instrumentation and of the things which can be determined as compared with those which could be determined in the 40s and even the early 50s has been surprising. I think another major thing which we would not have anticipated in those days was actually the amount of funding which the laboratories would get for their work. In other words, they finally have